Good morning. Today is August 28th, 2004. My name is Shaquille Avadani, and it's a privilege to be here with Mr. Avery Rogers, served in World War II, part of the 535th Engineering Drum Plant Company. Alongside me will be Mr. Rogers' daughter, Miss Lynn Rogers. She will help bolster the interview and allow me to get into great detail with Mr. Rogers' wartime experiences and his life. So if we could begin, Mr. Rogers, with stating your name, address, and telephone number for the record, please.
Okay, my name is Avery Rogers. Address is 1790 Poppy Avenue in Menlo Park. Phone number is 650-325-0569.
Okay, great. Now, let's start all the way in the beginning. When and where were you born?
I was born in Paso Robles, California, November 8, 1924.
Okay, 1924. And how was your family life like?
Well, up to the time I was 3, which I have no particular recollection, I think it was fairly routine. We moved from Paso Robles to Concord in about 1927 to a little golf course out in the country. And there were no other kids out there, so I grew up as the only child in a family and no children or others school age in the neighborhood.
What did your dad do?
My dad was a golf professional, but during the Depression in the golf course, you did everything. So he fertilized the greens, taught the members the whole banana.
So in the countryside, so what kind of school did you attend?
Attended elementary schools in Concord, which was about 6-7 miles away. I was the envy of the class in that I got to ride to school in a motorcycle sidecar in the morning, and everyone else would like to have done that.
As I understood, your parents were older, and your mother of the Avery family, had ancestors who fought in the American Revolution.
That's what I understand, yes.
Okay, so could you give us more information about your father and his background?
Well, he came from London, England, and I think dropped out of school at about the 8th grade. Got a job as a busboy on a Cunard ocean liner going between Southampton and New York. From that, got into waiting table and what have you in resorts in New England and the East Coast of the United States, and later ended up with a crew of waitresses going from resort to resort as the seasons changed in Southern California and other western points.
And how did he influence you as a boy?
Well, I guess by setting a good example. He kept our family together in terms of housing and food during the Long Depression, and that was an accomplishment in itself.
Speaking of the Long Depression, the Great Depression, how did that affect you and your family, as you recall?
It affected us principally through reducing the membership in the golf course, because except for salaried employees, a few at major firms in Contra Costa County, nobody had enough money to pay to play golf. So it made for hard times on the golf course, which affected our family. On weekends, my mother would make sandwiches at home, which is about a half a mile from the clubhouse of the golf course, and I'd take them in a little red Flyer wagon to the course, and we'd sell them at noon to the players, and also repaint golf balls. I'd find them, and then my dad would repaint them and sell them as part of a way to make a little bit of money to help during the Depression.
You had mentioned that your mother sometimes cooked parsnips and whatever vegetables were available during that time.
Yeah, that's particularly true after he left golf and got a little grocery store in Berkeley. And we had a little vegetable bin. It was a small store. And Mother would come down late in the day and take some of the vegetables that had maybe been there a day or two, were fading a bit, and that became dinner, including parsnips and turnips and things like that, which were not my favorites at the time.
Okay, so now we're in the 1930s. correct?
Yes.
And you're going through grade school. Let's. Was there anything significant that happened in that decade to you that you recall
I can't
before we
think of
go on to
anything-
high school?
Anything outstanding. We moved to Berkeley when I was in the high fifth, so I went to junior high, Garfield Junior High in Berkeley, and then on to Berkeley High in about 1940.
And you went to Berkeley High 1940. Now, could you describe your high school career?
Kind of busy in the sense that I was on a pre-academic program, living in Berkeley. Everybody aspired to go to the University of California. My dad's little store was about 5 blocks from high school, so right after school I'd go to the store to work in the afternoon, make deliveries and other aspects of a small store where credit was allowed during the tail end of the Depression.
By this time, as I understand it, Dad, your parents who had you, their only son, when they were older, were a bit older now, and your dad had gone from falling into the profession of being a golf pro when he was asked to teach golf lessons in Paso Robles, and now was a bit older, running this grocery store.
You know, he was probably 60 or beyond when he got the store. But he ran it, and it was a means of making ends meet.
Okay, so now back to your high school years. So I understand that there must have been a lot of competition for you, since there are many aspiring students to attend University of California. How was that like, that whole experience and ordeal?
One aspect that might, in a way, describe it is that I became, along with some of my classmates, became 1A with the draft board when we were still in the 12th grade. I had applied for some Navy programs that would lead to college opportunity, but my eyesight wasn't good enough to qualify. So I was 1A material all the way through the tail end of high school. Our principal, Ellen Laton, went to the draft board and urged them not to actually draft us until we had completed high school. His reasoning being that if we left high school before graduating after the war, we might never go back to an academic type endeavor, which has some advantages, obviously. So we made it through high school, and I was drafted immediately.
There's a cartoon in the yearbook that's here that really shows the dilemma. The Berkeley High 1943 high school yearbook shows a cartoon with the kids swinging between graduating and the draft board, and we have that here.
You know, they started to build a brand new auditorium, and because of steel shortage during the war, construction was stopped. So the cartoon, as Lynn just described, shows the graduates in this erector set like arrangement with just beams up on one of the girders with a big rope, and you swung across to the other side, and Mr. Laton was there, would hand the diploma. Then you swing across that opening, and here's a picture to the far side of this erector set affair, where the draft board representative was with a basket and took you, and you were in the Army.
So here's the cartoon that illustrates this, and here's the incomplete gym because of need for steel for the war. Was that it, Dad?
Yeah, the construction of that type that wasn't critical to the war effort was stopped to save steel and manpower, people power.
So you're a class of 1943?
Mm-hmm.
So, in your high school career, what subjects were you fascinated with?
Oh, I took all the basics, physics, chemistry, and that sort of thing that would help later on. Enjoyed Spanish class.
But did anything spark some any fascination?
No single item. Too busy to think about it, I think.
Oh, okay.
Plus, knowing I was going into the service.
So, okay, now Pearl Harbor bombing. When you heard about that catastrophe, how did you react?
Well, I don't remember a great deal about it other than it was a Sunday morning, as I recall. And I guess the reaction was one of shock, particularly with the loss of life and injuries incurred as a result of the bombing. it just reinforced the need to keep our nation together, because they had two wars going, one in the European theater and now one in the Pacific.
So did you consider that an impetus to get into the war effort yourself?
Or an impetus, or I knew it was going to happen. I was being looked at by the draft board very enviously because they needed to fill a quota. So it fell into place in that fashion.
Actually, Dad, when you were sharing the story for the digital movie, you mentioned that although you didn't have any evidence of it, that you wondered if higher-ups might know that the bomb was being developed, and that was part of the sort of speeding up of things during your epic.
Well, that thought came to mind later,
Later.
up the track after infantry basic at Fort Benning, Georgia. Apparently did okay on an aptitude test and was sent to Ohio University as a part of the Army's specialized training program. That was a program to get people through an engineering program, college level engineering or language being needed for interpreters. That program was cut short about a year or a semester after we started, because I think it was realized with the atomic bomb in the wings that we probably would never complete college in time for that training to be useful. So we were taken out of Ohio University and put on a train, and you might say back in the Army. We were in the Army, but now we're going to an active unit of some kind. That's what led to being sent to Camp Santa Anita, California, where the 535th Engineer Drum Plant Company, nobody's ever heard of it until this morning, was being formed.
Okay, so I want to, get back to the time frame here. 1943, you graduate, and you enlisted when?
Right away, I was
No, I'm sorry, you were drafted when?
drafted automatically, you might say. And
So,
infantry basic in the fall of 43, college in the winter spring of 44, and then into the 535th in Southern California.
I wanted to read the principal's message from the Berkeley High yearbook, 1943. This is Mr. Laton, principal, who says, "In planning our program and administrative organization, we have taken into consideration the constant demands which are arising on account of the war." And Ms. Hampel said, "Every day we say goodbye to another student who goes off to take his place in the armed forces, prepared, we hope, to do a better job because of the training he or she has received here. Priority must now be given to the winning of the war, and winning the war requires services of young men and women."
so when you were drafted, why weren't you, well, you were sent to camps, right, and you were trained?
Basic training, yes.
Okay, so you received basic training. So why were you a different case? Why didn't you go straight to the front lines and engage in battle? Why were you part of this engineering squad instead?
Okay, because I got in the Army Specialized Training Program, which in itself provided an opportunity to go through college in the Army. That was cut short for the reasons I just
Right.
mentioned, and we were put into what was being formed as an active unit in Southern California.
He went into that unit because of an Army aptitude test that was administered when he was drafted, and they assigned him to go into the specialized training program
Oh, because of the eye problem?
because of his aptitude test, which apparently showed aptitude in areas that they needed. And because of the aptitude test, they decided that he went to the Army Specialized Training Program first.
Getting into the 535th might warrant a note. When they put the outfit together on paper in the Pentagon or wherever, they drew from people who were already in the service in various fields, including a pilot in North Africa, to form the 535th with trained people. They knew there wasn't time to train people in refinery operations or building oil drums or whatever. So they just went through the Army personnel records and pulled people from all over the world when they put this together on a piece of paper, they realized the average age was going to be in the high 30s. And that's pretty high for an Army outfit. So you better get some young guys into it to do the gopher work. And here they had some people in college that are being booted out of college, not of their own doing. So we, 55 of us, were sent to join this outfit that was otherwise made up almost exclusively of people with years of experience in oil field work and refineries.
Some of the members of the specialized training group did go directly to the front from Ohio University, to your understanding?
I think so. When we left Ohio, we marched from the campus down the hill to the train station, and two trains came in, one heading east, this was Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, one heading west. We didn't know which train we would get on. We got on the one, turned out, heading west. The fellow that was kind of our leader could not tell us where we were going, so we went all the way across the United States on a troop train or a couple of cars hooked on the back end of passenger trains and freight trains. And we weren't told until we almost reached Pasadena, California, where we were going to stop. A little bit worrisome because with proper attention to Texas, my wife being from Texas, every time the train stopped in western Texas, take on water or something, we figured this is it. And some of that country is a little bit barren when you look at it from a train car.
So then you went to you found yourself at Camp Santa Anita, and this was at a time after the Japanese Americans had been interned there. When you arrived, then they were no longer there at that point, and you were trained at Camp Santa Anita, and also, as I understand it, in Los Angeles at an oil drum company.
They decided to move us out of Camp Santa Anita, which is Pasadena, to an area closer to oil refineries and closer to steel plants. So there was established for us a small Army camp consisting of a piece of barbed wire hooked from post to post and a sign put up, Camp Torrance. And this was out near Torrance, California. And we took training in the refineries and at the United States Steel Company plant in Los Angeles and remanufacturing in Southgate, and that training being focused on making barrels.
So what year was this?
This would have been in the spring of '44.
Okay. Okay, so now we're getting into the war. How did you feel stepping into it?
Well, I guess you feel engulfed, but you get so busy because of the many uncertainties, your concern about your family at home and so forth. We really didn't, or at least in my case, and I think it's typical, focus on what's this all about, or what's going to happen, or what are the principles behind it. We knew Pearl Harbor had been bombed, and that was enough. Mm-hmm. And you get so occupied in hour-to-hour, day-to-day activities that you don't really step back and discuss the pros and cons of the war and that sort of thing. That was a given. And we were on our way, and we figured we'd be sent overseas rather quickly, and we were.
So where did you first arrive after you left the States, when you departed?
Oh, we sailed from San Francisco and arrived at Finch Haven, New Guinea, 21 days later. The length of time, it's 7,000 miles to start with, but because our troop ship took a zigzag course across the Pacific to try to avoid being torpedoed by Japanese submarines.
You stopped at one point. You had a stop, and where was that?
We sailed directly to Finch Haven was the first, well, you refer to a stop, and that's what it amounted to. We never went ashore because when the captain went ashore to see where we were to go, nobody in the Army in Finch Haven had heard about us and knew what in the world we were supposed to do. So the captain's conclusion and the port commander was stay on the ship, it's going north, and that's the direction the war is going.
They basically then
And
pointed you in the direction of the war.
Yeah, the war had already come up to Finch Haven, the battles of Guadalcanal and that sort of thing. But we went farther up to Hollandia, northern New Guinea. That's where General MacArthur's headquarters had advanced to, in that he was making progress heading north toward Japan.
I understood that in general, a purpose might have been to back up MacArthur in terms of rebuilding or replenishing some of the ravaged Borneo oil fields and providing supplies for MacArthur's effort.
That was exactly it. He had a major effort going, and fuel is critical. Oil, gas, the whole works, including fuel for the bombers that were doing runs to Borneo, which had been taken by the Japanese. Somewhere along the way, they decided not to worry about building a plant to make barrels. There really wasn't time for that. So we put up a tank farm like you see near Richmond and Vallejo, big 55,000 gallon tanks like so, which we built in Morotai and again in the Philippines island as the war moved to the north.
So now could you describe exactly what your involvement was in the 535th Company? What was your daily routine like? Could you elaborate, please?
Well, at the outset, the daily routine, get up and eat whatever food was available. For the first part, it was all C and K rations, which are these little packages. They're still made for campers and that sort of thing. And then to go out and work digging trenches and whatever else was necessary for the piping to go into these big tanks.
Can you describe the events of your Christmas dinner, 1944?
Well, by that time, we had reached the island of Morotai, which was north of New Guinea, again, the direction the war was going. We had set up 10-man tents and worked out of them. And Christmas was coming, and we had two cooks, Stu Schechter and Louis Martinez. Schechter got his nickname of Stu because he was not a cook when he went in the Army. So his main focus was on opening cans of Australian bully beef, a type of stew, for dinner. However, because Thanksgiving was coming and we understood turkeys would arrive, everybody voted to have Louis Martinez cook the turkeys. These would be done in field ovens. They're about that big. The only problem was the Japanese knew it was Christmas Eve. They bombed the area, our company area, and blew up the ovens. So on Christmas Day, Schechter showed up as the cook, serving canned bully beef.
Well, what project did you particularly work on building? What was your contribution?
I worked most of the time on a pumping station down near the water. Tankers would come in from California and pump the fuel off up into the tanks we had constructed up on a little bit of a hill. And I ended up working on the jetty, which is a skinny pier that would go out to the ships, and later the pumping station itself.
Did you also build a water purification plant, help to build that and operate it?
That was later in the Philippines. When we moved on from Morotai, we went north to the Philippines, which if you look at a map, I've got one somewhere here, but if we need it, right across the bay from Manila. Bataan was where the historic death march had taken place in the very early days of the war when the Japanese attacked U.S. forces in the Philippines and overran them, including General Wainwright, who defended Corregidor, which is a little island much like Alcatraz is in San Francisco Bay. So that's where we got into eventually building a water supply installation to take care of those Army people in the area as well as the natives whose facilities had been bombed during the war.
So when you say your contributions, I'm trying to understand. Were you involved with the construction? I mean, did you pull up your sleeves? Did you roll up your sleeves and help build, or were you behind a desk, with a pencil and paper and designing these These.
No, I was not an engineer. I was in the field digging trenches and with the sleeves rolled up, as you aptly put it.
You also mentioned that sometimes as you worked on these projects that bullet fire, you could hear the exchange of bullets from the combat at a short distance from you.
Yeah, that was especially true at night. And you would hear the gunfire, and that was probably a quarter of a mile or a half a mile from where our company area where we slept.
So you're fairly close to the front.
Oh yeah, you could hear it, and we always, and at night with all the jungle, you worry about troops coming through and overtaking us. But the infantry divisions that were up front on the line, and I wish I remember the number, 31st comes to mind, but I'm not sure that's accurate, did a great job of holding them off. Mortai, where we were, could be visualized as an island the shape of a tomato, and we were on the stem. And that's all the United States had, was the stem part. The Japanese had the tomato. So we were, you might say, in a hold-your-own position. The United States did not desire to lose lives capturing the rest of the island. They just wanted to shut it off from contact with Japan. Eventually it would fold of its own accord, which it did.
When I grew up, and if you ever mentioned the war, you, as I see now, minimized some of the real dangers you were subject to. And I've wondered, do you think that other veterans, men and women who participated in the war, might have taken a stoic attitude and not blown their own horn? I'm wondering that from other veterans that I'm now meeting.
I think that's common, especially in those that were up front, saw a lot of loss of life of their friends, their buddies, and all the rest. We have a neighbor who was in the Battle of the Bulge, a famous battle in the European theater. And it was only recently that I learned that he had served in the Battle of the Bulge, which had a high percentage, of course, of casualties.
So now that you mentioned that, could you elaborate on camaraderie in your company?
Well, I'll try. It was critical because you don't have any entertainment like at night and so forth. What do? So you sit around and maybe in a tent, play pinochle, swap stories and that sort of thing. This was one of the pluses in my military service because I grew up as a kid in Berkeley, which is kind of a white-collar town, I guess you could call it, with a university there and so forth. I had not had the opportunity to meet many minorities, except some Japanese that were in high school who were taken away immediately after Pearl Harbor. Never saw them again. Our outfit in particular was made up of a lot of folks, men of Italian descent, Polish, the whole spectrum. And that was because they're the ones that had worked in refineries in South Chicago, worked in the oil fields farther south. We had a fellow in our company who was the co-owner of an oil company. His brother was home running it, and he was in the service. But this was an eye-opening experience for me to meet on very close quarters people of all kinds of backgrounds. It made it a lot easier later on in life, in work situations and otherwise, realizing that everybody can make a contribution. Didn't matter what background they had if they're given a chance.
You mentioned you mentioned a Hispanic surname and some folks who were Italian or Polish. Did you or your company, coming or going from the service, ever encounter any folks from what was then called colored battalions?
We did, but only to a limited degree. We had an outfit that was made up totally of colored in Morotai, not too far from us. In fact, they had a little baseball league going in the jungle, and their team often won. They were better coordinated than most of our guys. Our physician, the physician that served our units in Morotai, was a black doctor. And we had a lot of people from the Deep South who would not, or initially at least, refused to go to the doctor. They were not going to put themselves in the hands of a black physician. Over time, when they heard good stories, it turned out he was, I think, technically competent. but he was also very personable, low-key. They went, which was fortunate because they needed to. So that's one aspect of it.
Hard for some of us who grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and myself as a civil rights worker, to imagine how things were then.
So, time frame, what year was this? What year were we in?
This would be 44, 45.
Okay. So, any sequence of particular incidents that you encountered, something, anything unique that happened in your experience? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, while we were on Morotai, in the Dutch East Indies, north of New Guinea and south of the Philippines, we were short on convenience items and people who smoked, short on tobacco and so forth. Well, a ship came in, a freighter, to unload such supplies, and the rumor got around, and maybe fact, that it was going to go initially to the officers' club, and that meant those of us in outfits, mostly in the enlisted, and privates and corporals and sergeants, wouldn't get in on it. So that the first night, some of our people went down and kind of commandeered the situation, aided by one of our officers, and got in the front hatch of a freighter and came out with all kinds of toothpaste and candy and that sort of thing. And next day, when that was discovered, there was a big, hairy investigation, but nobody ever found out who took them. That's a true story, and it was justified in the minds of everybody who worked on it, that we were on the short end of the stick anyway, and here was a chance to catch up.
Was it there, or as you progressed, that you found the tent conditions to be slimy, moldy, and wet? And how did that later lead to the health problem that you incurred, and what did you do about it?
Well, I don't know if there was a direct connection. When we were in little pup tents in New Guinea, where our ship had taken us from San Francisco, and nobody knew what to do with us for a little while, we were in these little pup tents. They're about yay big, two guys in a tent. And that's in the tropics. That's 1 degree off the equator. So you get a lot of heavy rain. So we dug little ditches around, hoping that the water would go by. Well, the water didn't go by. The water brought mud, and the combination came in the tent. So you're not in good, in terms of keeping your skin clean and all, it's a challenge. The shower facilities were minimal, if existent at all. Little slimy creeks were in great demand. Get in, clean up a little bit. So you're living in a totally different environment. And that's why you really don't have time, or in many cases didn't take time to think about the war and all the rest. You're just trying to make it from breakfast to dinner and go to bed and hope you didn't get clipped.
How did these conditions lead to your hospitalization?
Oh, that occurred on Bataan Peninsula. Bataan's not that far from the equator, and when you work, I perspire a lot, so pores are open and fungus gets in, and I ended up with fungus on my face, all around my mouth. They called it jungle rot, was the term given to it, and that's a pretty good description. So the doctor came by about once every 2 weeks, would spend an hour at our place, and he gave me what was then the key item, sulfa tablets and ointments. That didn't do it, so I got shipped off to Manila to go in an Army hospital, where I was for 10 days or 2 weeks.
You took a boat there, and then you had to walk a couple miles to get to the hospital?
Yeah, when I took a landing craft across Manila Bay, went to the Navy dispensary, and they told me, you're in the Army, you've got to go to the Army hospital. And I said, well, how do I get there? And the guy says, you go out the door and you hike up the street. Well, the street was full of rubble, or had been. So every truck that went by, this cloud of dust. So that took an hour or so, and you're in the tropics. It's 100 degrees and the humidity 101. So that's how I got to the hospital in what had been a racetrack, and ended up in a ward there. I walked in, and the Dr. Eisenlohr, or a name like that, said, soldier, how'd you get here? I told him. He said, nobody brought you here to protect your face with all this stuff? And I said, no. They pointed to the north, and I took off. And he said, well, get a shower. I can't even see you, what your face looks like until you do. So I did. Ended up, of course, in the hospital for a while. And the stuff eventually went away.
Now, while you were there, in the enlisted men's hospital, there was an officers' hospital nearby, and you told a story about that, about someone coming to your hospital.
Yeah, there was an Army hospital at a former country club, at a big golf course country club in the north part of Manila, and that's where the officers' hospital was. But we knew there was one there, but that's all. But then a guy checked into our ward with a skin problem, and he was older. He was much older than most of us. Most of us were 20 years of age or 25 or something like that. He was probably 40. But he was kind of fatherly. So after supper in the afternoon, he'd say, hey, guys, how about going to a show? They got a movie tonight. And we'd go, and he'd kind of be the leader. He'd go to the kitchen to see if he could get something for us to snack on. We wondered how come he was in here. He far more mature than most of us. Well, the day he was to leave, he told us to come down to the administrative office of the hospital from which he would check out. And he walked in, and by that time had put on his uniform with a light colonel's emblem. In the Army, the full colonel's a spread eagle, and a light colonel's silver, I don't know what the word for it is, but it's like a deal like so. And he walked up and said he was checking out, and the guy behind you said, you're in the wrong hospital. You shouldn't have been here. And he said, I came here, but was told as an officer I should go to Wick-Wack or whatever it was called out in the country club. He said, I decided to find out how enlisted men were treated here in the Army hospital. So he said, I walked out, took my insignia off, and when there was a shift change on the admissions office, came back in. And I was admitted as a corporal or sergeant or whatever he told him he was. They overlooked the fact his papers didn't read that way, but he'd been in there the whole 2 weeks. So to us, he was a hero, because among other things, in the morning, he told the hospital director he felt it was totally unwarranted to make all soldiers get out of bed at 5:45 in the morning to stand inspection and salute the officer as he came through.
Especially the sick and wounded.
Yeah, it
Shouldn't
was
have to.
difficult for many to get up to do that, but that was the protocol in force at the time. We never had to get up after that.
So are we still in 44 or is this early 45?
Oh, I suppose, let's see, 45.
Okay. I was interested in if you could describe the process in which MacArthur's men, his forces, came in to fuel up. How was that process like? How did it work?
Well, the Air Force, a lot of our fuel was piped to Air Force bases. So that's how we got it, to the extent we were supplying aviation quality fuel for bombers and fighters. Now, I'm sure some of that was perhaps diverted to small coastal tankers that would go north. I don't know. I had no contact with them.
So it wasn't like the tanks swung by in a line and then they fueled up like that. So this fuel was like pumped to some other.
Well, pumped out to the airbase
Yeah.
on Morotai, and
Okay.
there it would bombers and other planes would come in, I'm sure, and fill just as they do at the airport here. Our job was to build a facility to accommodate the fuel when it came in on a tanker from Los Angeles and get it distributed in close to an Air Force base so it could actually be used in the war.
So I suppose you were close to an airstrip then?
On Morotai, we were right off the end of an airstrip.
Okay.
That was worrisome because we figured the Japanese would bomb the airstrip. It would be a logical target. And they did. They never, to my knowledge, hit the strip. They came very close to us. We had shrapnel flying around at night because their bombing runs were almost always at night. But it was close to the airstrip, yes. And in the Philippines, we were probably, 50, 70 miles south of Clark Field, which was a major Air Force installation north of Manila.
Now that I think about it, that would be, catastrophic if the Japanese came in to bomb that airstrip, and especially those barrels that you had filled
And these
with gasoline.
55,000-gallon tanks.
Yeah.
I ran the pumping station for quite a while, so you're sitting there in the middle of the night making sure the pumps are running and all that.
Yeah.
And you can hear the Japanese coming over.
Gosh.
So you count your chickies real fast then. And,
So you were in a very dangerous position in the war.
yeah, we were extremely fortunate in that they never hit the facility.
Again, I hear you talking the way other members of the greatest generation tend to talk, and often you folks tend to minimize some of the dangers you experienced. I think it was Bill Moyers who said that after the 60s, our attitudes changed and people wanted to sort of process feelings and talk about emotions and issues. But it seems to me that in general, were people more stoic and tried to be optimistic then and focus on the task at hand rather than to acknowledge or talk about the fear and the danger?
Yeah, your expression focuses the challenges at hand is the answer. As far as I am concerned, you were maybe not busy in a sense. There were times nothing to do, but you didn't have the mental alertness or drive to say, hey, we could get together here and have a discussion about the war. We're there to do it. We've got people telling us what to do. It kind of saps your enthusiasm for a big analysis. And
Did you all believe in the purpose of the war, as you understood it?
Yes, because the Japanese had attacked the United States. So it was the purpose of how it happened was very clear.
At that point, were you aware of things that we learn now in history, like about the Holocaust to the Jews and others, and about what was going on in Europe in terms of concentration camps, or even much about the Japanese Americans in our own country? Were you aware of these issues?
Not too much. I suppose in the Army put out a newspaper which tried to highlight what was going on in the world, but it was a very limited release. Communications was tricky or deficient. It was quite a while, and I would estimate a week or 10 days that we heard the Japanese had surrendered.
Really?
Yeah. We're out on Bataan, and what's to hear from?
Gee, now we watch wars on television.
Sure, but when we eventually got papers and stuff, and it showed MacArthur accepting the surrender on the deck of the Missouri or Iowa, that brought it together. It may not have been a full week. There were rumors and stuff, but in the sense of getting any comprehensive information about what was going on in the war, it was pretty limited. And maybe we were just too drained to be that interested, other than winning it and getting home.
Well, thank you. Now the Veterans Administration, say here in Menlo Park, is doing extensive work in a federal program with Vietnam and even Korea, World War II, and even a few Afghanistan and Iraq veterans now, including women, for the issue of post-traumatic stress disorder, which they estimate affects at least 20% of veterans in wars. Did you, looking backwards, did you notice any of your fellow soldiers experiencing signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, or did you suffer from that yourself upon returning?
I think I was fortunate. I went home. Actually, parents were there, mother for a little while, and on to college, and that kind of wraps you up for a period. I did see some cases. One at Fort Benning, Georgia, in infantry training, a chaplain came to see me and said that one of the soldiers in the unit down the road was from Berkeley and was having severe difficulties adjusting to Army routine, and that he knew, I was a neighbor, that I was in the service, and he thought at Fort Benning, so the chaplain had tracked me down, and we talked about it, and the chaplain decided it was in the best interest of the service to send him home, that he was trying to adjust, but not able to, And the Army didn't really have time to go through a therapy program, and I think it was for the good of everybody that he was returned home.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I want to get into your life post-war, after the war.
Mhm.
I just want you to describe first, if you would, to us what the incident coming home and what your number was on the ship coming home.
Okay.
And how you came home and what you all saw.
Well, after the war was over, the sequence of coming home from overseas theater was based on number of points each person had. You got points for 1 point for every month in the Army, and probably 2 points for overseas and 3 in a war theater, and kind of a priority system. You didn't come home as a unit. In other words, you left your unit. My unit was down to 20 of us, I guess, at that time. Went to, in my case, to Manila, and went through what they call replacement depot. You all come together and then sent home in batches. I had 45 points, and so the 50s were being processed when I got to the camp. But I noticed that some of them would leave the camp, be taken down to the pier where the troop transports were, and then come back, the troop ship having been found to be filled. And there wasn't room for everybody. So that was kind of a worry in the back. But anyway, the day came. I got on a truck in downtown Manila on the piers. Have a picture of that. And you lined up by number. The Marine Swallow, the troop ship, apparently carried 5,000, and I was 4,999. There was one guy behind me on the sweltering hot on the pier, and we figured we're not going to get on this baby. So we kept working our way up and up the gangplank, stepped onto the deck, and there was a colonel there, a bird colonel, full colonel. And he turned out to be the troop commander. The captain of the ship ran the ship, but the colonel was responsible for all the troops. And he said, "You two guys wait here." Well, this fitted into the pattern. They'd see if there were bunks downstairs for everybody. And after a while, he came over and he said, "I want you to do something for me. In about 4 or 5 minutes, the captain of the ship is going to ask me if my troops are ready to go home." And the other guy was a master sergeant. He said, "Sergeant, I want you to respond for all the troops up forward." Turned to me, he said, "You do the ones on the aft, or whichever side, doesn't matter." And sure enough, the captain came on a PA system and said, "Colonel, are your troops ready to go home?" He turned to us. We indicated we were. He turned then to the bridge, saluted the ship captain, and said, "The troops are ready to go home." Just then, the ship began to vibrate in that they had actually activated the propellers. The Army band on the pier played Sentimental Journey, a very popular song in those days. Some of you maybe know of it. Tommy Dorsey had a famous record, and we backed out and came home, and everybody bawling their hearts out.
What did you see when you came home? What was it like coming back to the San Francisco area on the ship?
Well, it was a long 17 days, and in the latter part was in the rain. We came into San Francisco on a late, I think it was January 31st or something like that, in a storm.
What year? This is 46?
Yes. And trying to see San Francisco, finally some lights showed up. It was raining. We came in. The only other incident was we got to the pier. Most of the guys went over to the side of the ship to look for their wives and families. I had not told my parents I was coming home because of this delay factor, which could lead to a lot of false alarms. And so I waited until it kind of thinned out, and a lot of the guys had left the ship. So then I went over to the railing, took a look, and my best, closest Army buddy was on the pier. I yelled to him, and then he pointed down the pier, and my parents were there.
You mentioned that the sight of dawn just lighting the Golden Gate Bridge brought tears of joy.
Oh, everybody was crying there, just as we cried leaving with Sentimental Journey. We cried getting home.
Okay, so if you could briefly talk about your life after the war. So what did you do when you arrived back home?
Got home on a Friday, hustled around Monday morning to get into the University of California. Found out
Oh, so immediately you didn't take like any rest. So Friday
Friday.
Friday evening,
Monday
Monday
I was
morning.
at Cal.
Wow.
tried to get in. The semester was already underway, so I was referred to the extension service where, like adults and night school stuff. The guy over there said, look, you ought to be in the university. So he phoned the director of admissions, said, I've got this GI here. He has all the college courses, in high school. I think you ought to take him, even though school's underway. He said, I'm sending him over. So I went over, and the guy said, well, I'll do it if you can get a transcript to me tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock or something. So I went down to Berkeley High. I was then told they were 2 weeks behind because all the servicemen were coming out. So they were deluged for requests, explained the circumstances, and just then the principal, Mr. Laton, came out of his office. He said, hey, you're back. I said, yep, and he knew me. I stood out a little because he knew my dad through the Exchange Club and my dad's grocery store. And he said, what are you up to? And I told him I needed a transcript, but I understand I can't get one quickly. He said, your dad still have the grocery store? I said, yes. He said, I'll be there at 5 o'clock with your transcript. He was. I got him Cal the next day.
He was glad to have that you were one who had survived.
Well, he had a thing on the wall in his office, all the names of all the service students who went into the service, and he went over and checked me off as having.
So from after that, you finished UC Berkeley with a degree in accounting, and you then immediately got a job with the United States Geological Survey, working first sweeping up as a clerk, and eventually becoming the administrator for the Western United States and Alaska.
Well, I went to Cal 2.5 years, got out of school on a Friday, graduated Monday morning, went to work for the U.S. Geological Survey. No rest period in here.
Okay. Again, wow.
As an accountant. That was in San Francisco. When they set up a regional office in Menlo Park, I transferred. I wasn't the administrator of the survey. I headed up the division that provided administrative support, just in case anybody hears this, they might think I was bragging. And 37 years later to the day, retired, and then went to work on retirement jobs, like driving cars for car dealers on trades and that sort of thing. And I've since retired from that.
And you married first our mother, Lorraine Rogers, who was attending UC Berkeley and we all lived with your dad. I was born first, Lynn, and then Diane and David. Mm-hmm. And you subsequently in your life married Irene, and
who's here today.
Helped raise her teenage children and have quite a few grandchildren now and step-grandchildren. So what else do you want to say about your life after the service?
Oh, I think I just had a very, very fortunate life, even including the service, because as it turned out, it got home, and that was an eye-opener, as I indicated earlier, in many, many respects, and I'm grateful for it.
I think that hearing all this and being part of it has really helped me at least know of your real heroism. I really admire you for what you did.
Thank you. I don't know that anything heroic about it, but did what I was asked to do, and that's the typical arrangement when there's a war underway, and I was lucky. And I appreciate the efforts of all the folks here working on this project to bring back memories and information about World War II service.
So that wraps it up on a great note. I'd like to thank Mr. Rogers for taking his time to share his story. Do we have any questions from the audience at this time?
Mr. Rogers, if you can describe the American people during World War II from what you saw on the home front and in the military in one word, what would that one word be?
Well, one word might be resourceful, in that in the service you visualize trying to activate a major military push in the Pacific where you have no bases to mount anything. The logistics alone required for a great deal of resourcefulness. And then people who, homemakers, went to work in shipyards, had to take training, completely different lifestyle. So resourcefulness comes to mind, that it was the resourcefulness of U.S. citizens both those that served ultimately in the military, those that worked in war industries, and those that filled in behind them in hospitals and schools and all kinds of endeavors.
Your earliest American ancestor, Jonathan Avery, fought twice in the Revolutionary War on the Continental lines. Your ancestors came with John Winthrop in the 1600s. Do you feel like you've carried on an American tradition?
Oh, I hadn't thought of it that way, but I suppose that's true.
Well, again, thank you, Mr. Rogers
Oh, you're
and
most
Miss
welcome.
Rogers, Miss Lynn Rogers. Thank you so much. It's a great interview, and it's going to be preserved permanently, Library of
Thank you.
Congress.
New experience for me and a very pleasant one.
Thank you.